just 5:30 now. We're going to give people a few minutes to sign on and then we'll get started. So thank you all. We do have a number of folks on the call tonight or the Zoom. So people can mute unless they're raising a question or speaking. That'll be helpful just to manage background sound. I'll go through this again, but if you're on the phone, you can, sometimes you have to *6 to unmute and mute yourself, even if you have a mute on your phone. That's the Zoom mute. And as well, if you're on the phone, you can actually raise your hand for a comment or question with *9. Will actually raise your hand as if you were in the Zoom meeting. So that works as well. And I'll go over that again in just a little bit. All right, welcome everybody. My name is Patrick Field from the Consensus Building Institute, or CBI, facilitating tonight's working session for fisheries regarding the Maine floating offshore research array. So thank you for joining. A few folks will probably be coming on board as we get started here. So I'll go through a few preliminaries. So Zoe, if we could go to the next slide, that would be great. So again, you all are incredibly tired of this, but for Zoom, as you know, mute yourself because we have a large number of folks on the phone. You can unmute yourself when you raise your hand or called on to speak, no problem. If you're on the phone, *6 will mute and unmute you. And then if you want to raise your hand, if you're on the phone, *9 will raise your hand. And that will be a way to raise your hand, actually, even if you're just on the phone. And we'd love to hear from folks on the phone as well as on the Zoom itself. If you're in Zoom, there's 2 ways to raise your hand, depending on whether your Zoom is older or newer. Super annoying, sorry. If you're in the older version, if in the participants tab, which lists who's there and the mute and unmute, there's actually a little place that says you can raise your hand there. If you have a newer version of Zoom, you scroll to the bottom of Zoom and there's a control bar, and it has reactions at the bottom right, typically. If you click on that, there's several things like a party hat, and there's also then a raise hand function there. So depending on the version of Zoom, you can find your raise hand there. If you're on Zoom and you just can't find the raise hand function, you can put in chat, hey, I have a question I want to speak. Just put your name and then I'll know to call in. You don't worry about that. The chat function is free for people to use for comments, questions. We may not get to all of those. Sometimes there are like factual questions people have or a URL people have, and we can put that in chat and do a little bit of kind of side conversation as needed. And we can also use that to call on people if you have a technical issue, and Zoe can help you fix it. Great. And Zoe's contact is right there. Again, you can use the chat if you have it. If you're having technical problems, you can also email Zoe, and she will do her best to help you out. So that is our approach, hopefully, for Zoom tonight. Next slide. Okay, so here's the general flow of things. Again, a little bit of these preliminaries. And then we really want to kind of just take a step back and put the context for the research array. And Celina is going to cover that in just a little bit as we do that, and some initial questions about the overall process. And then really the primary purpose of tonight is about siting and fisheries considerations and concerns. So 605, we're really going to cover, Meredith's going to cover some broad kind of siting issues and the like to go through. We'll talk about kind of where we are. We'll take some initial questions. We'll take a break at 6:35 for just 5 minutes if we need to. And then we really are going to go with Carl Wilson, going to really dive into some detailed maps and discussion on what DMR is learning to date and what your feedback and dialogue around that learning as we go to think about siting this research array. Very briefly, 7:25 will do next steps. We promise to keep these to 2 hours to respect, especially fishermen who may be fishing all day, not to mention early in the morning. So we want to adjourn right at 7:30, and we'll try to really stay on time in that regard. Okay, next slide. Again, we're facilitators, so we like a few ground rules, probably nothing new here. Again, our primary focus today is really, go back one, please, if you could, Zoe. But backwards there, sorry. Thank you. Is our focus is on citing regarding fisheries considerations tonight, so that's our primary focus. If people get to stay attuned to the meeting as best they can, given Zoom is exhausting, especially end of day. We welcome questions and comments. Given the number of people, we may not be able to get to everybody, but we'll do our best. And we also are providing plenty of content information between meetings too, which we'll share. Again, if you have a point, a comment, a question, try to keep it brief just so we can answer it and other people can weigh in as well. We are not looking for agreement. We're looking for input and advice and conversation. The only thing we ask is people be respectful as well as direct and constructive. We are recording the presentations, and if there's some basic questions about the presentations, but in terms of the dialogue, we are not recording that. We are taking good notes without attribution, so we have a record of what the advice and suggestions are, but we don't want to record the dialogue, so people are free to say whatever they want to say, and we'll capture the substantive part without attribution as well. Want to be really clear about what participation in this working session means. You are participating, giving advice to the state of Maine, DMR, and GEO, so that they can do their best to advance this siting process and the research array as best they can. That does not constitute, in your participation, approval of offshore wind, endorsement of this particular development, endorsement of a particular site, endorsement of a particular configuration. All it is participating to offer your view and opinions and understanding and expertise and knowledge for the state so we can do the very best it can for siting, which they will own. So we want to be really clear that, again, the participation is not endorsement or acceptance. It's we appreciate people's time and effort to engage. Okay, next slide. All right, I'm going to hand this over to Meredith at this point.
Thanks, Pat. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. I think I know many of you, but I'm Meredith Mendelson. I'm the Deputy Commissioner at the Department of Marine Resources. If you're here tonight, you probably know that offshore wind is part of the state's long-term clean energy vision. We're pursuing, as a state, a multi-phased approach, and Celina will talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. You may have heard about a regional task force, the BOEM Gulf of Maine task force that convened its first meeting in the fall of 2019 now. We're still participating in that leasing planning effort as a state, so that work continues. But as you probably know, in November, the governor announced that she was interested in pursuing a multi-turbine research array in federal waters. She committed to work with stakeholders to cite that and to develop the research strategy. We held some initial webinars back in December. They really targeted heavily the fishing industry to try to get the word out about the proposal. And then I'll talk a little bit more, Zoe, if you could go to the next slide, please, about the rest of the process as we go forward. But first, I wanted to just reflect back some of the concerns that I think we've heard from the fishing industry in the last couple of months. Certainly, we understand that the industry is really concerned about this project, largely opposed to it. But I wanted to take a few minutes, as I said, to just summarize some of this. I'm not going to talk through the responses to the concerns that we've heard. Where we've heard things in the form of questions, we've really tried to articulate a response to that on the governor's energy office website. There's an FAQ document, and there will be a link to that web page at the end of the meeting. So I encourage you to go there to look for more information. I encourage you to reach out to me or to Celina or to Carl or Kathleen Reardon for continued discussion around some of these issues. We're working on the development of additional materials to get information out more broadly and to provide resources for those of you who want to get into the details of these issues. But as I said, I won't be talking about these topics in detail tonight. We want to focus the discussion tonight on the siting issue. So that really relates to the first item on this slide. We know that there's a lot of concern and question about whether people will be able to fish in the array or around the array. We definitely, I want to be clear, the goal is to test fishing activity in the array. We want to learn whether or not it's possible to fish within a floating offshore wind farm. But obviously that's a complicated question. It's likely to vary by gear type. We know there will be impacts from displaced effort. And we know that the industry is concerned about pointing to someone else's backyard. Obviously, fishing within an array would be dependent also on weather and conditions and the judgment of the captain. So there's a lot of complexity there. Overall, we know that the industry has really emphasized that nowhere is a good place for this. We hear that loud and clear. A lot of people have also asked about how the siting impact will impact different fisheries and marine mammals, particularly at a time that the lobster industry and other fixed gear fisheries are facing significant regulations to protect whales. People have raised concerns around the electromagnetic field from the transition cable and how that might interact with key species, concerns around the impact on benthic habitat and essential fish habitat. Next slide, please. A lot of people have raised questions about the economic case for this project and for offshore wind generally, asking what is the benefit to the state of Maine versus the cost to existing industries like the fishing industry? How will the energy cost be borne by ratepayers? What is the job creation potential versus job impacts to the fishing industry? Why are we pursuing offshore wind versus onshore wind or solar? That's a question that we've also tried to address. And some of the discussion around decarbonization objectives, Celina will talk a little bit about tonight. I think one of the other key things that we've heard is how does this research array potentially play into growth of floating offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine? Is the research array going to have a role in what is driving the growth of offshore wind, as there is obviously a fair amount of growth in southern New England and potentially interest in the Gulf of Maine? Is it going to influence those drivers? Are there other drivers for the growth? And lastly, I think one of the things that is an important question, one of the most important questions, is how will we use what we learn in the research array to inform future development? What commitments will the state make as a result of these lessons learned, and how will the data be public, and how will we use this data to inform future projects? Also, there's questions around timing depending on commercial development. Will the timeline of what we learn from this project fit into that bigger picture? Next slide, please. So I want to switch gears to the detail of our outreach process related to these work sessions and where we are. As I mentioned, back in February, we had a workshop that's the top item on this page, the State of the Knowledge workshop, just to try to develop some common ground and understanding about the project to set some groundwork for these working sessions. We've also established a series of webinars that we've begun to put out to put more information about offshore wind generally out for the public's access, and also some of the key areas of potential impact and questions that we've heard from people. So here we are in these series of working sessions. There's two parallel tracks. One is on wildlife and one is on fisheries. As you know, this is the fisheries group. The wildlife group had its first meeting last Friday and will meet again in a couple of weeks. We anticipate that this group will really get to dive into a dialogue around the siting and the research framework. We may meet a bit more often. We're trying to have shorter meetings in the evening to accommodate schedules of fishermen. So that's the reason for that. The wildlife group is meeting during the day in a slightly longer sessions. After these working sessions, or perhaps during later work, DMR is hoping to take some of the work that we've been generating from these sessions out to people for small in-person meetings. We are assuming that COVID numbers will hopefully stay low and we'll be able to do this in April. So that's the dockside work that you see here. And then we're anticipating that these working sessions will reconvene as joint sessions with the wildlife community to bring the information together in a way that reflects the work that each each track of working sessions has done to inform the state in siting decision going forward. Next slide, please. So the opportunity of this working session for those who are familiar with this area is to provide advice to the state about siting, project design, and research themes of interest to you. I want to emphasize again, as Pat said earlier, that participating in this session, whether you're just attending or you're speaking, or if you want to follow up individually with any of us at DMR or GEO, we will not interpret that or your presence here tonight as constituting approval or endorsement of offshore wind, whether it's this project or generally. We appreciate your presence and we want your input. Next slide, please. So again, our objectives for today are just to, hopefully we've given you a little sense of the goals of these working sessions. We're going to review what data the state has related to fisheries, fishing activity, and gaps in fishing activity data. That's really the meat of the discussion at the end of the meeting, at the 6:30 timeframe that Carl will be covering, and solicit your input to help inform the siting. Next slide, please. And I'm going to hand it over to Celina.
Thanks, Meredith. We'll hand it to Celina, and then we'll see if there's some questions or comments. So Celina, over to you.
Thanks, Pat. Hi, everyone. I'm Celina Cunningham, Deputy Director in the Governor's Energy Office. And I'll just take a few minutes to provide a little bit of context for those of you who haven't necessarily been part of all of our meetings to date. So next slide, Zoe, please. So in 2019, the governor signed a number of bills to address climate change in the state and put forward a plan of how best to address climate change as a state, and also set significant renewable energy targets. And part of the work of decarbonizing our state will require more electricity as we try to move away from fossil fuel use in our transportation and home heating areas most significantly. And so we will need new sources of clean energy. Recently, the Governor's Energy Office released a report that we worked with a consultant on to assess how best to meet our renewable energy needs over the next decade. And what is clear is that a diverse portfolio, including a number of renewable energy sources, is beneficial for the state, and that offshore wind is part of our long-term vision for the state. Next slide. So the state has developed a offshore wind initiative to pursue strategic opportunities for additive economic activity and innovation across a number of sectors in Maine, and to maximize compatibility with existing marine users. I don't need to tell this audience how the importance of the fishing industry to the state from an economic, cultural, and community standpoint, but it's something certainly that we are thinking about as we consider ways to bring offshore wind energy to the state. And then we recently received funding from the federal government to develop a offshore wind roadmap. And the plan for this is to develop a long-term vision for the state to develop, address opportunities and challenges as we consider offshore wind in Maine. And so in this effort, we'll be looking at onshore aspects, including ports and infrastructure, existing assets and opportunities associated with manufacturing, supply chain, and our workforce, and also from an R&D and innovation standpoint, how Maine can participate. We'll also continue the work of the research array and the research priorities going forward through the roadmap structure, and also take a look at existing ocean, environmental, and fishing industry information that we may need or want to get as we think about future activities related to offshore wind. This will be a stakeholder process, and we will launch it in the hopefully fairly soon, that we can have more dialogue about a number of these topics when we're looking at the long term for Maine. Next slide. So in terms of the projects that we are pursuing in the state, the governor is committed to taking a phased, deliberate approach to bringing offshore wind to Maine for a number of reasons. Number one is that given our water depths, we will likely require floating technology, and most of the projects in the world are fixed bottom. So there's a difference there. We want to better understand the technology. Number two is, as we all know, the prevalence of the fishing industry. We really want to find ways to minimize impacts and hopefully find ways to coexist to the maximum extent practical that we can as we continue to advance offshore wind. And so we started with a 2013 University of Maine 1/8 scale project. The university is partnering with New England Aquaventus on a 1 turbine demonstration project off of Monhegan in state waters that's targeted for 2023. And then the state has announced in November, as Meredith mentioned, the research array, which would be a project of 12 turbines or less in federal waters. And while we're early on, a target of around 2025 for a project in the water. As Meredith mentioned, we are part of a regional task force for that is part of the federal decision making for commercial leasing. And we know that process will probably continue. Our intent is to ensure that our priority is to get the research array in the water and get data from the research array prior to permitting of projects on commercial leases. So that's our phased approach there. Next slide. And this is just wanted to give you a visual of the University of Maine technology that we intend on using in our project. It's made of steel, I'm sorry, of concrete, not steel. And it can be made here in Maine, which is unique, and that creating Maine jobs here. So that's one of the benefits of it. Next slide. In terms of who is involved, so the state of Maine, this will be a state-led research array. The Governor's Energy Office is leading this effort. We are partnering closely with a number of state agencies, including DMR. We are working with New England Aquaventus, which is owned by Diamond Offshore Wind and RWE Renewables on the project, and we're working with the University of Maine with their technology. We're also having conversations with federal agencies and our state counterparts to ensure coordination throughout the various stages of this project. Next slide. And so, as I mentioned, we're using we're intending to use floating technology on this. We will use floating technology on this project. And unlike fixed bottom, there is not a lot of worldwide data about floating projects. There, according to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, there are 84 megawatts of floating offshore wind in the world. I believe the largest at this point is 5 turbines with a one for 11 turbines that's under construction now. I will note that the industry is growing rapidly, and the Carbon Trust estimated that by 2030 there'd be over, I believe, 10 gigawatts of floating offshore wind worldwide. So it is growing, although to date the projects have been smaller. So the state is in partnership with New England Aquaventus is committed to working with ocean stakeholders on a broad range of research goals. And it really is at the heart of what we are working on doing here. And that the areas that we'll focus on, I think Meredith will touch on these a little bit later today, but include environmental and baseline data and looking at environmental interactions, fisheries interactions, and then a number of technology research goals that we will pursue. And I'd say that we have done a fair amount of thinking about this, but also really open to input about where areas that additional research is needed in order to minimize impacts to fishing activity and the marine environment. Next slide. In terms of where we are at with the project, so we're in this earlier phase in terms of engagement and outreach. The state obviously wants to get input prior to identifying a site. Once we identify a site, we'll submit an application to the federal government. They'll review it and make a determination on to whether they'll issue a lease. When a lease is issued, we'll begin the process of planning the construction of the project and the construction plan, and going through NEPA and additional federal approval of that plan prior to anything being built in the water. And we think the timing is somewhere around 5 years, 5-6 years in order to see the project in the water. So that's the overall timeline, and we'll continue to engage with stakeholders throughout the various steps of this process. Next slide. And with that, I will hand it back to Meredith, I believe.
And I think, Meredith, I think we're going to pause and if there's some, before we kind of dive into the sighting, if there were kind of general questions on the overall presentations from Meredith and Celina that people wanted to raise questions, we'll do that first before we start, kind of framing up the sighting broadly and then actually dive some deeper into the data that DMR has been gathering. So are there, questions, comments for either Meredith or Celina on kind of what we've presented so far? And again, you can raise your hand or you can just note your name in chat. And if you're on the phone, you can hit *9 and that will raise your hand. I'll give people a minute to kind of note that. And I think Monique put in in terms of the concerns fishermen have, I think there's a broad range of concerns and Monique noted several of those, which is helpful. So thank you, Monique. Daniel, you have a question or comment? Daniel.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Daniel Salerno. I work with fishermen out in New Hampshire. And I appreciate the list of concerns that you guys have put together already. I would just like to add one more, specifically more to the concept of vibration or any resonance coming off these windmills themselves and potentially traveling down the cabling systems. I mean, obviously fish feel pressure underwater. Whales are using sound to communicate. I would just add that as another concern of potential sound, additional sound vibration in the water column from this from the windmill. Thank you.
Daniel, thank you. And I think,
Thanks, Dan.
thanks, Dan. Alex, I thought Alex had his hand up briefly. Seemed to go down again. But Alex, over to you if you want to speak. I think, let's see, Barry, your hand's up next. So Barry, go ahead. Barry, if you are on the phone, what you can do is hit *6. That will unmute you. So see if we can get you off mute and then just speak and I'll confirm I can hear you.
Okay, how's that better?
That's Barry. That's perfect. Gotcha.
That's great. Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, I think on one of the last slides presented, there was a mention of baseline studies, and I have a question. I'm wondering how long these baseline studies should take to look at the the benthic environment, and there's really three components of a baseline study for this kind of thing: wildlife, chemical, and fish. And the current scientific advice appears to be that there should be 2 to 3 years of baseline studies before any action, any construction is undertaken. And I'm just wondering what sort of a time frame you have for these studies and what kind of things they'll cover.
I can start with that one. Thanks for the question, Barry. So we obviously, there's a desire to start the baseline studies as soon as we can once we identify a location, because like you, we want to start collecting as much information as we can. I think that the time frame you raised aligns well with the overall process of going through the permitting. And we have to get initial permitting to go through to do some work, and then doing an environmental review of the project will take a number of years too. And so I think that will be within that range. I don't have a specific time frame that we have at the moment, but that's our intent at the moment.
Okay, thanks very much.
Very, thank you.
And I just also add that I think that the developer needs to collect relevant information to plan the project and do a micro-siting of the project. In addition to that, I think we're open to dialogue about what baseline information would be useful to use while we are out there. So we welcome feedback on that.
Great, thanks.
Great, thank you, Barry. Other questions to kind of our opener here for Celina or Meredith?
I have a question. I'm sorry, I couldn't find the.
Yeah, Jeff, go ahead. No problem. Go for it.
So I'm sorry, I was trying to catch the slides as you were going there, but where in the timeline do you have the meetings with the zone councils that would be affected? the Lobster Advisory Council.
Jeff, I can take that. I think, we're anticipating talking with zone councils as the project develops, but I don't know that there will be a specific set of zone council meetings on this project before the application is submitted.
Okay, thanks. That's a lot different than any other project that we've seen in our area. I mean, for instance, we've had the Portland Harbor Dredging Committee at our zone councils for years before it was permitted. I don't even know if it's been permitted yet, but I think the way they handled it is far better than the way this seems to be being handled at this point. Thank you.
Jeff. Bob Humphrey, you have your hand up.
Hear me?
Yep, Bob, I can hear you. Sound good.
I participated in the wildlife section on listen only mode, and I noticed that there was quite a diverse group of invited participants from federal government, federal agencies, NGOs. Is there somebody participating in this particular workshop from NOAA, NOAA Fisheries, or other NGOs that represent commercial fishing?
So Bob, I do know there's some fishing association folks on the line. I don't know about NOAA or NIMS, if any, or the New England Fisheries Council. I don't know if anybody who can just kind of speak up if they are from NOAA, NIMS, or the Fisheries Council. You could either just, Doug.
There are a few folks from NIMS on the call. Certainly at the regional office. I can't see the full list, so I'm not sure if there's anyone from the Science Center, but Michelle Bachman from the New England Fishery Management Council is also on.
And Doug Crystal's on as well. So Doug's on. And there may be others. Good question. Great. Bob, any follow-up to that?
No, thank you.
Nope, thank you. And also just to note, in the process of trying to keep these open and inclusive and let people kind of come and go as they see fit, rather than to kind of create a membership, these are open. So really whoever wants to come and listen or engage, we certainly hope fishermen and fishing associations and those who know the Gulf well will, but these are open to kind of who wants to show up. Jeff, you're up next, Jeff Smith.
Thank you. I had a question. I wanted to follow up on Barry Gibson's question regarding baseline data and what's collected there. I think it's an important topic. And my question is, what degree, if any, of flexibility does the state have if they begin to collect baseline information and they learn things through that process and perhaps want to adjust the lease area that they've requested from BOEM? And I assume that request is going to go in the next few months or something. I'm just wondering, is there any ability to adjust the boundaries if you learn something in the baseline data collection period, or are you pretty much locked into what you asked for permission for initially?
Our goal is to identify a location that would be workable. We'd have to go through a regulatory process to make any amendments to that after it's submitted to BOEM. So we'd like to get it, identify the site and to start.
Okay, and then you can do microsite. You can use that information to do the micrositing within the lease area, right? If you learn things to, where you actually construct the turbines, if you learn things during baseline, as long as you stay within the envelope of the original lease application.
Absolutely, and that's, we don't know what size turbines will be kind of market in the market at the time, and so we also the project will be up to 12 turbines, so there'll be some flexibility there too as we look to site.
And Jeff, as you noted, over the next few meetings, we'll try to touch on configuration because it might be related to the interests you all have, and also maybe research questions, but it's not something that has to go into the application. Just the envelope, right, Celina, is what goes into the application.
We have to get the shape and the direction, what shape the lease is in, and where exactly it is.
Great. All right.
If I could just come back real quick to Jeff Putnam's question about the zone councils. I think we're certainly open if the zones want to have those discussions in the next couple months to doing that. I think a zone council meeting obviously would probably have to be on a virtual format, which is, I know not ideal, but we could do that if folks would like.
seeing some few heads nodding, by the way, as I look at least a few faces I can see. So Lauren, I can see a good party nod. So good. All right. Great. All right. We're gonna have plenty of time for questions as we dive in. I think let's go ahead and move. We're gonna now start really wrestling tonight with the siting question. Now we're going to start kind of broadly, provide some information you've all been asking for, and then we're going to start, kind of take a broad view, siting criteria, and then we're going to kind of go deeper and deeper into terms of some of the data and the learnings that the DMR is gathering as they gather data from talking to individual people, looking at data sets. Like Virginia, I think you wanted to get in, and I maybe missed you, so Virginia, please jump in right now. Sorry about that.
Sure. I'm just wondering how wise it is to move forward when we are now finding out that we've got grant money for a map, but we've already started on this journey. One. And I think my second question is, it's very troubling and problematic when we hear things come back to us. I was listening in on the Monhegan call, and industry is very clear that we do not want wind in the Gulf of Maine. And there's been no question about that. And then we hear things come back like industry doesn't want wind, but when you speak to the fishermen individually, you get a different response. So that is very problematic for participation in things like this. So I just wanted that noted as well.
I guess, thanks, Ginny. I appreciate that. I'm not sure what the comment was that you're referring to, because I wasn't on the meeting, but I guess I would just say from DMR's experience, I think across the board, I think almost everyone we've spoken to has raised significant concerns with offshore wind and has not wanted to see development in the Gulf of Maine. But I would say, I think we've had also very good conversations with people one-on-one about some of those concerns to put more context to them. So that may have been what was trying to be conveyed. Again, I don't know what was said, but that would be, I think that would be, if I had said something like that, that's what I would have meant.
And what about the roadmap? Why would we not, make a plan, see what we're doing, where we're going, and then follow that map? Why would we start our journey and then make a map?
I have a few thoughts on that. One is that the state has been working on offshore wind for over a decade and quite a long time, and has done a lot of work in a variety of sectors to look at opportunities and challenges there. The roadmap effort is looking at really from a long-term perspective. And when you think about the project development, we see a window of opportunity to do a smaller scale project in the Gulf of Maine first. And so the research array, we think, is the prudent step in advance of larger commercial projects. I think the concern with waiting for several years to submit an application to start a 5-year process for a research array, given the momentum and interest in offshore wind writ large in the East Coast and from various different points, I think regardless of Maine's position, we do believe that offshore wind is coming to Maine, and that in terms of larger scale leasing, and that if we do want to have this phased approach, that we need to start the process now, understanding that it will be more than 5 years before we have the project in the water. And in the roadmap process, we are not going to get into specific siting conversations. It's really about planning for other aspects of the project, of the industry.
Okay, thank you both very much.
Thanks, Jenny. Sorry I missed you, Jenny. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So I just want to note, I think for fishermen in particular, we want to note the kind of dilemma you're in. You're kind of darned if you do, darned if you don't. If you do participate, you're kind of helping something you do not want. And if you don't, the decision that might be made might be worse for something you don't even want anyway. So you're kind of in a pickle. And so the folks who are taking time tonight and going forward, despite your serious reservations, we really appreciate, and we know this is really tough, and you have a lot of other stuff going on that makes this tougher. And so this doesn't help to acknowledge it, but we want to note it. So with that, I think we maybe kind of start in on the broad piece in terms of kind of citing, and then we'll kind of begin to dive in. Meredith's kind of start, where they're going to have Carl dive in, and they're going to have some back and forth about some of the data and what they're learning and what you all want to share or think about, shaping that learning as well. So Meredith, I think I will hand it over to you.
Great. Can we go back to the slides, please? Thanks, Zoe. I'm going to cover some ground that some of you who've been participating in the other meetings may have seen before. So I'm sorry in advance for repetition, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody kind of had the same baseline understanding. Next slide, please, Zoe. At the outset, I want also to just kind of run through a couple of slides to help you visualize what the array might actually look like on the water. This is a schematic of how the turbines would be anchored and connected to each other. Each platform is going to be roughly a mile between turbines from each other, but that's also, I think, open for input if more space might make a difference or less space. It's a semi-submersible platform, as Celina mentioned, and that will be held in place by multiple anchors. I think the goal is for that to be a drag anchor if the bottom type is soft enough to accommodate it, and catenary mooring lines, likely chain, but possibly synthetic line to those anchors as well is an option. The turbines will be connected by inter-array cables. The goal is to have those inter-array cables, they're pictured as the red lines on this image, come straight down from the turbine within the footprint of the mooring lines or chains, and then be buried between the turbines. Or if the bottom doesn't allow that, then secured in some way to the seabed. Again, I want to say the state does hope to be able to test whether fishing activity can occur within the array. I realize how those inter-array cables ultimately are laid will make a difference, certainly to mobile gear and potentially also to fixed gear this far offshore with long trawls. The inter-array cables will then join to the transmission cable to shore, which is also hoped to be buried to mitigate impacts to fishing. If it can't be buried by adjusting the route to remain in mud, there will be some form of mattressing to hold the cable in place over hard bottom. Mattressing does not necessarily preclude mobile gear fishing, though we certainly realize it may have an impact to a range of gear types, as well as potentially to habitat. Next slide, please. Here's another similar image to give you a sense of scale. That's a little fishing vessel in the middle of the array there. On the next slide, please, Zoe. You can see what the turbines would look like in relation to each other as part of an array. Again, here each turbine is roughly a mile apart. The circles here are not necessarily depicted as watch circles. Obviously, that will depend on the depth of the water and the anchoring system, what the watch circle will ultimately be. Next slide, please.
Meredith, there was one just question factually on that. There was a question about how long the chains or mooring lines would be. I don't know if you have an answer to that.
I do not have an answer to that. I'm sorry.
Okay. And again, sometimes if there's good questions that we just can't answer tonight, we're going to note those in chat and try to add those to kind of ask questions and the like. So it's totally fair question. Some of the good points added we'll track as we go too. Yes,
certainly we can try to get answers to those in the FAQs or for next meeting as well. We'll try to return to those. So just to review kind of where we are in the site selection process, from the top of the slide, the state did establish initial siting criteria that I'll go over in a minute based on the technical needs and objectives of the project. DMR was asked to conduct an initial review of the available geospatial data to inform our understanding of the area at the state level. So looking at the green line, you can see we started by reviewing the publicly available data sets on the New England Northeast Ocean Data Portal and the Marine Cadastre. These are both public portals available to anybody who wants to go look at these various data sets. They included AIS and marine transportation data. We looked at the VMS data for federal fisheries from 2011 to 14 and 2015 to 16. There are older geospatial maps as well of the fishing grounds of the Gulf of Maine. There are exclusion areas for the Department of Defense that we looked at. We looked at species distribution for protected resources. We looked at the available bathymetry, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. And we looked at some low resolution substrate data. There's a lot that we know that we're missing information about. Obviously, one of the key things here in Maine is the lobster fishery. There's very limited spatial data of the lobster fishery, both fishing activity as well as transit. Very limited data on benthic substrate. We have some significant gaps in this area for high resolution bathymetry, as well as other non-VMS fishing activity, so other state activity or fisheries that do not require VMS. So we're really looking for better characterization of that fishing activity, even within what we have available, and hoping to gather more information through this process. There is also some economic analysis that's available through work that NIMS has done. Since that time, we've also brought in other ecological concerns, additional marine mammal abundance and distribution, bird and bat migration and foraging, and other habitat issues. We've looked obviously at the charts for obstructions, shipwrecks, military zones. We've looked at some of the historical issues and paleocultural potential resources, and obviously the geology of the area. So that work leads us to where we are right now, which is in the light blue stage, where we've been for a month or so soliciting input from a range of stakeholders who use the ocean space that we're looking at, especially those in the fishing industry. And again, in this stage, we're really hoping to eliminate areas from consideration, as well as refine our understanding of other areas. So that's where our work today is heading. And as you can see, we're also reaching out and having those conversations to the question earlier about NIMS participation and council participation. We are, in addition to their presence here tonight, trying to interact with our counterpart agencies in other states and at the federal level outside of this process as well for better understanding of their particular concerns. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just go over the siting criteria. Some of you have seen this a couple of times. We needed to be near potential high voltage electric grid connection sites in proximity to the electric load. So there are two potential points of interconnection: Maine Yankee in Wiscasset or Wyman Station on Cousins Island in Casco Bay. We have not made a decision about the cabling and interconnection points. That will come later in the planning process. The siting is at least 20 statute miles from shore. That's partially to reduce inshore fishing conflicts as well as visual impacts. We're not looking further than 40 statute miles from shore because of the economic considerations of a project this small. It just becomes economically unfeasible to go further. The minimum depth was 150 feet. There is not a maximum depth limit within the area that we're looking. And the minimum is for the technical considerations of the technology. We're looking for mud or gravel bottom to accommodate the anchoring, but that is not sort of a prohibitive issue. Obviously, we're looking to avoid highly trafficked areas and minimize conflict with fishing grounds to the extent possible, as well as other navigation and shipping traffic. Next slide, please. Here is a zoomed out view of the area in relation to the coast. Many of you are also very familiar with this at this point. I just want to point you to the blue dot on the right-hand side that is meant to be representative of the area that would be that we would be looking for the lease, 16 square miles in size, relevant or relative to the rest of the area of interest here. We'll zoom into this a little bit more in the siting discussion in a minute. Next slide, please. As I said before, we really want to obtain your feedback in this meeting about where this array should not go or where it might go with less impact. In a few minutes, Carl will go over what we've already heard from fishermen about the area, and we hope you'll provide us with your reactions to that. In future work sessions, we also hope to discuss the configuration or the layout of the turbines within the array and how it might be oriented. If fishermen have thoughts about whether a particular layout or orientation would help to minimize impact, we certainly want to hear that kind of feedback. Next slide, please. We'll have this slide again at the end of the presentation as well, but there are a number of ways that you can provide us with feedback. Obviously, within these work sessions, there are additional materials, as I mentioned, on the Governor's Energy Office website as background material, and some live GIS mapping tools, as well as the map that I just showed. You can call any of us at DMR individually or Celina, but Carl and Kathleen in particular to talk about some of the specific siting issues if you want to talk about where you're fishing and your activity. And then also, if you want to meet with us one-on-one, we'll be trying, as I said, to get out and talk to people individually or in small groups outside later this spring. Next slide, please. Actually, I think you can leave that up because that's where we are breaking. Yeah.
That's where we're breaking. So I think there's a few questions. I think Matt or someone had their hand up, so I don't know if they wanted to speak first. I have some questions from chat I want to ask. But yeah, Matt, there you are. Matt, go for it.
I just find it awful hypocritical that lobstermen are being told that we have to reduce our end lines in the exact area where this research array wants to go. We've been issued an incidental take statement from NOAA. Is the research array going to have an incidental take statement from NOAA? I guess my main concern is I find it awful hypocritical that we're being told to reduce end lines, and they want to put chains and mooring lines that never get checked or hauled like our end lines do right in the migration path or the alleged migration path of the endangered right whale.
Thanks, Matt. I think you're raising a really important point. It's certainly something that the department is concerned about. I know our colleagues at NOAA Fisheries and the Protected Resources Division are concerned about this. We've heard from a lot of people who are concerned about the protection of whales. I think there is potential for concern, particularly around gear getting entangled in the moorings and that causing a secondary entanglement to a marine mammal. So we're definitely going to be assessing that, and that will be part of the permitting process for sure.
Great. And Matt, to your question of the specifics of kind of NOAA's review, I don't know if you can speak to that, or if NOAA's on board to see what kind of they do, what kind of review or permit they have to do as part of this or other wind projects.
As a federal decision on the project, there'll be a consultation with NOAA on the project, and we will make sure, and we'll need to meet existing regulatory requirements in order to be permitted.
There is a few comments about, is it possible that these platforms could have multiple uses in addition to the turbines, about aquaculture, fish processing, other functions? What is being explored in terms of multiple uses for these platforms?
In terms of multiple uses around the world, you are seeing things like hydrogen production or things like that. At this point, we have no intent to have multiple uses at the project, and would want to talk to stakeholders prior to making any decision about anything like that.
There's a question about marker buoys. Are they going to be placed between turbines? What distance would they be? Would those be vertical lines? How would you anchor the marker buoys?
That is a great question, and I don't have an answer for it right now, but we will mark that and try to have an answer for the next meeting.
Great. A few people asked for where to find out more about the wildlife. So in the chat, I know there's a lot of good stuff going on there, but Laura's put kind of the general link. It's also on this slide for getting to the Offshore Wind Initiative, and then you can find various information around these different efforts, including some of the work that the wildlife folks are doing. There was another question about is it just is it EIS that will be required, an EA, an environmental assessment? What about, is it simply going to be a finding of no significant impact, a FONSI? What's the kind of scale of environmental review this research array would have to undertake?
Yeah, so it's a Because it's a federal decision, it will be up to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to determine the appropriate level of National Environmental Policy Act review. That will happen twice, one at the lease stage and then another at the project stage. Traditionally, the Bureau has done environmental assessments at lease stages and environmental impact statements prior to any project, but it's up to their decision.
I did have just a logistical question about the slides. Laura, are we posting these slides on the website so people can get at them after meetings? How can people access the presentations from this or other working sessions?
We have not, but we certainly can. The website that I put up, which goes directly to the work sessions, will have all the information that we post for the work sessions. So we're still working on the recording from the wildlife work session. We're actually creating a YouTube channel, so it's easier, I guess, to access recordings that way. So hopefully all that stuff will be coming online shortly and be a little bit more timely and fluid after each meeting.
And again, if anybody goes on there and can't find like a presentation or agenda, then don't hesitate to email anybody on the kind of the list, including us or our folks, and we will get it to you as much as we can. I think there is just a question from Virginia noting that they would like the state to ask for the kind of the most stringent environmental review of this process. So I just note that in the comment. And again, some continued concerns about entanglement and whales and the like as well. Okay, I think we should just keep going. I mean, if people need a break, they can certainly take a brief bio break. I think Meredith, Celina, Carl, I think people are jumping in, so I think we should just keep going if that's okay. And Carl, I think at this point I'm going to turn it over to you, and we're going to start kind of going a layer deeper here on siting. DMR is trying to learn as much as they can, get as much input as they can from all of you, from people individually in these meetings, whatever way they can. So Carl's going to try to share along with him and the work that Kathleen have done together, kind of what they're learning, and want you then to respond and react to kind of what they're learning and add your additional thoughts and input and deep knowledge. So Carl, over to you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Pat. Good evening, everybody. Pat, just a bit of housekeeping here. I was wondering if I can share my screen.
Yeah, I think so. Why don't we have you jump off and let Carl share his screen, and then he can use his cursor over various maps and things, which is a little easier to see.
All right, and just confirming that you can see it.
Yes, we can. So far, so good.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, I hope everyone can bear with me for 15 minutes or so as I try to work through some of the information we've been looking at. Again, my name is Carl Wilson. I lead our Bureau of Marine Science within the Department of Marine Resources. Been with the department for about 22 years now. Myself and Kathleen Reardon, our lead lobster biologist, have been kind of taking the lead and responding and reaching out to the fishing industry on an individual basis and trying to, kind of work through and gain more depth into our knowledge of this area. So again, just kind of jumping back out, Meredith just showed this to you. I was anticipating that we'd have a break. So just to remind you, again, we're talking 20 to 40 miles offshore, off kind of the mid-coast area of Maine. And the area of interest is spanning lobster zones D, E, and F. And it's kind of anchored on the southern portion by Platts Bank, which is kind of running on that 40-mile line. If we go in closer to the actual area of interest and just kind of a quick orientation around the area, you've got some potential spots that are already highly unlikely that we would be sighting, or recommendations would be going forward around sighting. And that's the two shipping lanes, the eastern approaches, the western approaches, and this area in pink here. And just to confirm, Pat, can you see my cursor as I'm moving it around?
Move it around one more time. Yep. You can see
okay.
It. It's small, but you can see it. Yep.
Good. Usually I just wave my hands around a lot, and so you'll have to bear with me with the cursor. This DOD exclusion area is also an area that would be highly unlikely that a sighting location would go in there. Again, on the eastern side of the area is Zone D, covers the entire span of Zone E and into Zone F. This green line that runs around is the 24 nautical mile line And you have the 12 nautical mile line here just for some reference and different various discussions. Again, you know, there is some publicly available information, and then there's a lot of data gaps. And really, this is, you can start right in and start talking about some of the bathymetry data that we have for this area. Again, this data is available through the Northeast Data Portal, which I think Laura has already put into the chat. But our area of interest that we're talking about right now is available there, so you can do all this mapping yourself as well. So overlaid on top of the chart is known kind of high level bathymetric data that we have for this area. And it goes from extremely good to very poor. In the southern portion around Jeffrey's Ledge, Platts Bank, we have very good and high resolution multi-beam data to the point where we can literally see the drag marks as icebergs left the Gulf of Maine and headed out either the Northeast Channel and bumped into Platts Bank and then continued on their way out of the Gulf of Maine through the Northeast Channel or the Great South Channel.
Carl, sorry to interrupt. Just the depth there, what unit or metric is the depth in there? Is it fathoms or feet? What's the?
Yep, all these depths, all the numbers here are in fathoms.
Thank
you. Yep. So again, you have very high resolution data in the southern portion. In the mid portion, you still have a little definition, but you can tell it's nothing as close to as the southern portions. And then in this northern portion, right around what's called the mistaken ground and around the eastern approaches shipping channels, we have very poor bathymetric data and information around bottom types. This area, you know, if you look at the map, it looks like kind of featureless, or look at the chart and it looks like featureless mud. Some of the context, as we've talked with people, this is actually a very dynamic area, and coincidentally to this, the NOAA survey ship Hassler was out in this area, I believe either last year or last couple of years, and has mapped much of this area in this kind of shaded red box here. And so we've seen a sneak peek, and I believe for our next fisheries meeting, we'll be able to display that publicly. It hasn't gone through the quality control process, so it's not publicly available to download, but I think we'll be able to talk about it for our conversations. And what I've seen of that, it's absolutely astounding, some of the geological features that are on display there. And I think it's going to really give us pretty good coverage for bathymetry in this area. And really this, you know, a map is kind of the formation of a lot of these conversations that we're having. I'd start in saying, just kind of jumping into some of the data that we have and some of the data that we don't have. There are fisheries and recreational or commercial fisheries that we have very little spatial data in this area. And then there are other fisheries that we have much higher resolution data, and that these fisheries are required to have onboard vessel monitoring systems or trackers that kind of ping their location periodically. So recreational fishing is one of these areas that we have very little data. And we have started to fill that in through you know, our conversations. And what just kind of quick take-home message from our recreational fishing conversations to date is that Platts Bank is an unbelievably important area for this fishery, in that it's one of the last reliable groundfish spots that we have. And really, Platts Bank, I said earlier that it kind of anchors this area of interest, and it's really revealing actually how important Platts Bank is to any number of fisheries, every one that we've been talking or will talk about. And it's also clearly, you know, very important to the recreational fishing community as well. I'll just move on here. Lobster fishing. So this is the same area now with a depth mass. So the light blue area is depths from I think it's about 50 fathoms down to 90 fathoms. And based on some of the conversations that we've been having, there seems to be this transition of much higher activity in the shallower water in this area. As we approach 80, 90 fathoms, then the lobster fishing activity starts to decline, and it's more periodic activity. If one of the things that we started realizing and just where our gaps were is talking with some of the commercial lobstermen. They really have described the mistaken ground rather than kind of featureless mud as a pretty dynamic area, as well as the area to the immediate to the east of the eastern approaches, and I think that's allowed us to just provide some richness to our conversations and to our understanding of the area. Where again, if we were just looking at the map, you see this nice broad bathymetric line at 90 fathoms, and again, from what I've seen, it's anything but this nice broad meandering line. There's a lot of up and down and variation in these areas. If we move to the ground fisheries, so multi-species, and what this image is showing us are pings, relative intensity of vessel monitoring systems pings that are being recorded by National Marine Fisheries Service. And so areas in green are where there's relatively less activity, and yellow and orange denote high activity. And just this sample from 2015 and 2016, your mind and your eye, immediately jumps to areas here on the western side in this very distinct boundary. And this is the western Gulf of Maine groundfish closure on the western portion of our area of interest. And then a very, highly used groundfish tow kind of spanning between the closed area and Platts Bank. We also see some activity up in the ship, at the end of the shipping channels, and maybe a hint of some activity over here on the eastern side of the area of interest. Again, context is really important. If you look at simply this 2015, 2016, you get one impression of groundfish activity in this area. If you pull in additional years, as was suggested with some of our conversations with ground fishermen, you get a much more complex and nuanced picture here. You have the same pattern, except for now this western Gulf of Maine tow, or this western area tow between Platts Bank is very well defined. Now Platts Bank is showing up as a very important fishery, and we're understanding, there's, again, recreational fishing, gill netters there. And then as you head east, and now my mouse is gone. Okay, as you head east, this area on the eastern edge really starts to come into the definition as another high intensity use area for ground fishing. And so just kind of comparing and contrasting, the more context you have, the more information that you're able to bring into any sort of decision making. Other fisheries that have these kind of VMS tracking systems would be scallops. Platts Bank comes out as important. Herring, Platts Bank, again, is important. And areas just to the north in the Kettle area here in Zone E as being another important area. So again, none of these conversations are popular to have. I have not had one conversation, and I think Kathleen would confirm that we have not had one conversation that people are saying, yes, put it here. This is where you need to go. I think at best we are getting just context into what the fishing activity is. and what some of the use patterns are. When we looked at kind of some of those early groundfish maps, we interpreted lack of ground fishing in one area as being, kind of, this is where we thought maybe lobstering was going on as well. And again, through these conversations, you actually see that there's multiple users using this space all the time. And so, kind of an overall picture of our conversations to date is that there's impacts everywhere. We are not going to find an area that is impact free. We may be able to provide guidance on areas that are less impactful, but there is going to be, there's clearly going to be impact. And just generally speaking, themes that we've heard to, minimize impact is deep, distance from shore. The further you go from shore in this area, potentially the better. Mud bottom generally has fewer conflicts, but it will have conflicts. But deep, distance, and mud are kind of the themes of that we're looking at as well. So this final map, again, it has the 90 fathom depth mass that I showed earlier for lobster. But I think just kind of walking our way through from west to east. In the west, you've got the Western Gulf of Maine closure. So that and a lot of marine mammal activity that brings issues. You have the southern approaches to Portland. You have a large groundfish activity in this tow. That's very important to not only the Portland fleet, but also neighboring states fleets as well. You have Platts Bank used by virtually everybody. Shipping channels, DOD, defense area, exclusion area, and then again, large mixed activity between lobsters and groundfish in this western, or excuse me, eastern area.
Carl, one thing, people would be helpful if we could see what a 16 square mile circle or square.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah, I missed that on my first slide here.
Okay.
Okay, so here's our area again, and this black box up here would represent 16 square miles.
Okay.
And that's a square configuration. There could potentially other configurations, but that's a square.
Thank you. That's great.
And so I'm pretty much done with just kind of finishing up on that general overview.
Right. So I think now a few things. I think there was a question about multi-species data and particularly later data, maybe 2017 to 19. And I think maybe people are awaiting an update to the portal for that. Carl, do you know the status of newer data on multi-species?
I've heard it's in the works, but I'm not privy to anything that's not in the data portal.
Okay. And we can certainly ask the data portal when that will be available or released, so we can certainly post that as a question.
My recollection is it was not particularly imminent, not in the next couple months, I don't think, but it is underway.
So at this point, what we want, I think Carl's kind of laid out what he's learning, what Kathleen's learning, what DMR's learning. So want to add to that additionally other comments you have about things that you say, yeah, that sounds right, or oh boy, I think you missed this, or I have a question about. And then also, if need be, Carl's got access to the state GIS. So at any point, if you want to kind of go to a more, Carl can pull it up to a more interactive map and we can drill down and pull up layers, whatever you want to do. So now's really the time for discussion. Raise your hands, say you want to comment in chat. If you wave your hands, I may not see you, but you can just put it in chat and I will. So Jeff, you're up first. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So a number of the boats, myself included, use AIS. Try not to use it all the time, but I'm working around the Western approach pretty often. Sorry about that. Out on Jeffries, so I do turn it on. Is there any AIS data, or is it too far from the station for you guys to record for the small boats?
Jeff, there definitely is AIS data, but like you said, it's intermittent.